There was a strange silence recorded in the minutes of the small church in Marrowthicket in the winter of 1899, a silence that would begin months before the sisters' disappearance, when the reverend wrote in stiff handwriting, "Whatever is beginning here has begun slowly." And before we continue, tell us in the comments which city you are watching from and what time it is there right now. This is the kind of sentence that, to a historian, means nothing at first glance, but, reviewed after so many years, becomes the initial shadow of a mystery that would spread throughout the Cumberland territory. The protagonists of these records are Eleanor and Ruth Marrowthicket, sisters only 3 years apart in age, daughters of settlers who had settled in the region in the 1860s when the forest was almost untouched and the trails were more rumor than path. In 1899, the sisters lived in a small wooden house south of the Whistling Pines Trail, in an area surrounded by dense oak forest and low hills. The region, although isolated, was organized. There was a makeshift post office, a community barn, and 3 larger farms that supported the rest of the families. Eleanor, the eldest, was a volunteer teacher, austere, methodical, known for the impeccable handwriting that appeared in all the local hat shop records. Ruth, on the other hand, sewed for almost the entire community. She was reserved, introspective, but extremely observant. Later accounts say that the two were inseparable, walking together daily to collect firewood and seen discussing in low voices near the old fence in the early afternoons. The community's routine was simple and rigorous. Wake up before sunrise, feed the cattle, check the fences, take supplies to the people in the hills, and pray in the late afternoon. That year's winter, however, would arrive a little earlier and more intense, leaving residents uneasy. There was something in the air, according to the few formal statements. A different weight. No explicit threat. Just that feeling that the elders described as a year that did not present itself cleanly. In the records preserved in the county archives, there is frequent mention of the Marrowthicket sisters in November of that year. Letters sent to their mother, who lived 2 villages away, reported unusual fatigue. Ruth described headaches and strange perceptions in the deep woods, although she never detailed what she saw. Eleanor, more sober, mentioned unexpected movement on the West Trail, but attributed it to hunters who frequently crossed the region. The community, however, seemed to notice something different. Church minutes mention that residents began locking their doors earlier, an unusual habit in the region, as nights were traditionally quiet. Small, unexplained incidents began to appear in oral accounts collected decades later. Gallons of water knocked over in the morning, footprints that seemed to appear and disappear in the thin mud, and the disappearance of 2 chickens from a nearby farm with no sign of intrusion. When these accounts are placed side by side, it becomes clear that they form the silent backdrop to something bigger, something that no one yet understood. And at the center of it all, there was always a reference, however small, to the 2 sisters. The reverend, in one of the rare personal comments in the minutes, wrote, "The young Marrowthicket girls walk as if they perceive what we do not yet see." However, the most puzzling element among all the documents is precisely in a supply report dated December 14th, 1899. It mentions almost carelessly that Eleanor requested access to the community warehouse to check an old compartment in the basement, informally called the vault, used decades earlier by the first settlers to store documents and tools during storms and animal attacks. It was a forgotten space, mentioned only in the oldest accounts. She signed the register, entered alone, and remained there for exactly 23 minutes. The report ends abruptly. No note about what she saw, no additional information, no comments from those responsible, just the time she entered and the time she left. This is the first strange point, the first real silence in the timeline that would culminate in the disappearance of the 2 sisters. And according to subsequent documents, it would be in that same vault that the last confirmed clue would emerge before everything went dark in Cumberland territory. In the archives preserved in Cumberland County, the period before the Marrowthicket sisters' disappearance has always been described as the most normal period of their lives. However, when analyzed carefully, With the cold attention of a researcher who knows how tragedy forms in silence, one realizes that nothing there was really normal. Normality, after all, is often the last mask before the rupture. The sisters' daily lives were marked by disciplined, almost choreographed movements. Eleanor woke up before the light touched the windowsill. The firewood was already stacked in the corner of the kitchen when Ruth came down the stairs with her hair tied up haphazardly, still sleepy. The two prepared a kind of rustic porridge, divided tasks without arguing, and left for their daily occupations with such precise timing that some residents swore it was possible to set their watches by the sisters' footsteps on the trail that led to the center of the community. The makeshift school where Eleanor taught was just over a kilometer from the house, inside an old log building, a legacy of the first settlers. There she taught children of various ages to read and write, alternating between reading aloud and basic arithmetic. Ruth spent her mornings sewing on the porches of her neighbors, a craft that kept her in touch with virtually every household in the area. In several interviews collected decades later, the older women in the community remembered her presence with almost uncomfortable clarity. When Ruth arrived, it seemed like she already knew what we were going to ask for. It was this kind of observation that years later would take on a different, more disturbing meaning. At the time, no one imagined that those small behaviors, that exaggerated attention to detail, that habit of looking at the woods as if waiting for something, would form a mosaic of ignored signs. The approaching winter changed habits and temperaments. With the cold, conversations grew shorter, the streets grew quieter, and visits became rare. The sisters, however, kept their routine virtually intact, although some neighbors mentioned subtle changes in their behavior. Ruth seemed distracted, as if her attention were always a few steps ahead, on something no one else could see. Eleanor, on the other hand, became increasingly rigid, more controlled, as if she feared that any carelessness would reveal something she was not ready to explain. What is most striking in the records, especially in the school notebooks preserved to this day, are the side comments made by Eleanor in the days leading up to the disappearance. They are mundane observations, but loaded with strangeness when read in the light of history. Fewer birds on the trail, fewer voices in the afternoon, unusual movement near the south fence. She never detailed these movements, and no subsequent reports have been able to explain exactly what she meant. What is known is that around the first week of December, Eleanor asked students to avoid the West Trail on their way home, a recommendation she had never made in years of volunteer service. The elders of the community recall that same week, the wind seemed to echo differently among the trees, as if something heavy were being carried invisibly through the valley. Meanwhile, Ruth was spending more time indoors. In her last recorded sewing orders, there was an unusual delay in deliveries, something that was not part of her profile. Later testimonies indicate that she even refused 2 orders in late November, saying that she wasn't feeling well enough to go out. The sister-in-law of one of her customers wrote in her personal diary, "Ruth seemed tired, but it wasn't fatigue. It was as if she were hearing a noise that no one else could hear." However, the most significant point of this period is not in the diaries or testimonies. It is in a simple, almost bureaucratic document, filed among unimportant papers. A formal request from Eleanor to access the vault, the forgotten underground storage room in the community warehouse. She made the request alone, without mentioning Ruth and without explaining why. For a small community where everything was shared and every movement was visible, this solitary gesture stood out as incongruous. In addition, some residents reported seeing the sisters walking late at night toward the low hill, near the trail that led to the valley, where, months later, 63 horsemen would be reported missing on the Cumberland transport routes. At the time, there was no connection between these facts. But in historical reconstruction, this temporal intersection became unsettling. The most consistent reports say that in the last week before the disappearance, Ruth began to board up the windows with wood, even though the cold was bearable and no storms were forecast. Eleanor began to keep notebooks in a metal box, locking them with a key that she wore around her neck. The most disturbing detail, however, only appeared years later when one of the sisters' mother's diaries was found. In the last letter I received, Eleanor wrote that there is still time. But time for what? She didn't say. When you read all this, impeccable routines, small deviations, silent concerns, you realize that the story of the Marrowthicket sisters did not begin with their disappearance. It began long before. It began with the almost invisible changes that no one understood at the time. And at the end of that December, that quiet normality would break, but not abruptly. The rupture would come as a slow, discreet slide, starting at the most unlikely point, the moment Eleanor returned alone from that forgotten vault, carrying in her gaze something that no one could name. The disappearance of the Marrowthicket sisters did not occur abruptly or dramatically. It formed like fog, slow, silent, without an exact milestone, just a succession of small gestures that, when reviewed decades later, reveal an almost inevitable sequence. The last confirmed day of the two begins on December 19th, 1899, a Tuesday. The reconstruction of that day is based on three main sources: the school attendance book, 2 notes in Ruth's sewing book, and a late testimony from a farmer named Thomas Breyer, who claimed to have seen the sisters walking together at dusk, the last recorded hours. On the morning of that day, Eleanor taught class as usual. The notebooks found indicate that she worked on reading with the children and ended class half an hour early, explaining that she needed to check an old record. This coincides with the note in the community store, where her name appears accompanied by an unusual observation: requested the key before sunset. Ruth, meanwhile, delivered 2 sewing orders before noon, but refused 3 others with the same excuse as always: "I'm not sleeping well." The women who received her visits later reported that she seemed nervous, as if she were calculating invisible distances or listening to footsteps in the distance. Around 4 p.m., according to Thomas Breyer's testimony, the two were seen walking side by side toward the center of the community, wearing long coats and with their hands hidden in their pockets. Breyer said years later that he tried to greet them, but both seemed too distracted, as if they were going to revisit something they didn't want to revisit. That was the last time anyone saw them outside the warehouse. The passage through the vault official record showed that at 4:47 p.m., Eleanor signed the community warehouse entry book. Ruth did not sign, a detail that intrigues historians to this day. All that is known is that both descended the narrow staircase to the vault, an underground compartment abandoned since the 1870s. The vault, as described in old reports, was a damp space, smelling of rusty metal and with uneven stone walls. There were remnants of broken boxes, lanterns without wicks, and a reinforced chest that, according to local rumors, held documents from the first wave of settlers who attempted to map the transportation routes between Cumberland North and the Whistling Pines Valley. The obscure point in the story is the absence of any note about what the sisters did inside. The logbook only indicates the time of entry. There is no time of departure. The next name recorded appears more than 3 days later, when a group of volunteers went down to begin the search. Decades later, one of the lanterns found in the vault showed signs of use, as if it had been lit recently that late afternoon. But no one was able to prove this, and this is where the mystery narrows. The Whistling Pines Trail. The hypothesis most accepted by local chroniclers is as follows. After leaving the vault, the sisters followed the west trail toward the Whistling Pines region, the same trail Eleanor had asked her students to avoid. A hunter claimed to have seen 2 female figures walking in that direction at nightfall, but his testimony was never considered entirely reliable. The weather that night was particularly strange. The moon was obscured, and the wind blew in short gusts, stirring up the fine snow that had accumulated near the fences. There are reports that farm dogs became restless for no apparent reason. The oldest of these reports, recorded in the diary of a woman named Harriet Mullins, said, "It seemed as if the wind carried footsteps with it. Not heavy footsteps, but a cadence that ran through the trees." This record, read in isolation, could be ignored. But when placed alongside the testimonies about noises coming from the valley and the unexplained absences of animals that same night, it creates a dark backdrop for the sisters' walk. The last material trace. The only object definitely associated with the disappearance was found 4 days later, frozen under a thin layer of ice just over a kilometer from the vault. A small metal box, identical to the one Eleanor used to keep her notebooks in. It was empty. Curiously, the lid of the box had vertical scratches, as if it had been opened in a hurry. These scratches, analyzed in 1931 by an amateur investigator, were recent. They were not due to natural wear and tear on the object. There were no footprints nearby, as the previous night's snow had erased any traces. This finding on its own would be just a loose clue. But 3 details added to the strangeness. The box was positioned perfectly parallel to the trail, as if someone had carefully placed it there. One of the corners was slightly warm when it was collected, a fact that was reported but never explained. A piece of grey fabric, consistent with Ruth's clothing, was found stuck to the inner lock. This was the last material trace of the sisters. The night of the breakup. The archives show that, around 9:30 p.m., some families reported hearing something like a distant echo coming from the valley where the oldest settlers had dug the first transport routes decades earlier. Routes that years later would be marked by the disappearance of 63 horsemen who tried to cross them without leaving a trace. It is precisely here, at this point, that the sisters' story symbolically intersects with this other tragedy. There are no records connecting the events. No official document establishes a direct relationship, but there are temporal, geographical, and atmospheric coincidences. And for those who have studied both cases in depth, these coincidences are difficult to ignore. On that night of December 19th, a mixture of wind, silence, and absence settled over Cumberland. No one saw the sisters return. No one heard their voices after 5 p.m. No objects other than the box were found. What is known with absolute documentary certainty is only this. The Marrowthicket sisters entered the vault in the late afternoon, and they were never seen again. The last indirect record of them appears in the diary of young Abigail Turner, written on the morning of the 20th. The valley dawned differently. I can't explain it, but it seemed as if something had been torn from the landscape. This is the point where the climax meets the void, where historical reconstruction reaches the limit of all that could not be preserved. And it is precisely at this limit that 4 days of intense searching, contradictory statements, growing rumors, and collective anguish would begin, shaping the next block. The period when Cumberland realized that there was no longer any normality to recover. The morning of December 20th, 1899, began with a silence so thick that many residents would remember years later how the air seemed too still for that season. The community's routine was only broken when Thomas Breyer, the same farmer who had seen them walking at dusk, noticed that the West Trail had remained untouched since the previous night. No recent signs of human footsteps, no footprints leading back. He was the first to suspect that something was wrong. The start of the search, at 9 a.m., Breyer notified the reverend and 2 neighbors. In less than an hour, the first search party was formed. They walked along the Whistling Pines Trail, calling for Eleanor and Ruth, but the forest returned only broken echoes, the kind of silence that does not respond, only absorbs. The community warehouse was checked before noon. There, they found the logbook open, Eleanor's signature still fresh, and an irregular dust mark next to the stairs leading to the vault. When they went down, they found the room cold, abandoned, and with no obvious sign of the sisters. What caught everyone's attention was the position of one of the lanterns. It had fallen, but was not dusty like the others. It looked like it had been used recently. The smell of kerosene was still noticeable. The news spread throughout the neighborhood. Within a few hours, almost the entire community was involved in the search. Fragmented testimonies. In the first 24 hours, residents offered confusing statements, which would only be organized into a coherent narrative years later. A woman named Clara Henders claimed to have seen 2 female shadows near the south fence the night before, but admitted she could have been mistaken due to poor lighting. Young Michael Connor, only 15 at the time, said he heard a muffled scream coming from the direction of the valley. This account was never proven, but it was repeated in different variations by other residents, all mentioning some kind of distant noise that night. Harriet Mullins, author of the diary that would become one of the most cited sources by later chroniclers, wrote, "The wind seemed to carry something in it, not sound, but absence." No investigator has been able to turn this phrase into objective evidence, but it accurately illustrates the kind of emotional atmosphere that prevailed in Cumberland at that time. The appearance of the box. During the second day of the search, 3 men, Briar, the Reverend, and a farmer named Ezra Caldwell, found Eleanor's small metal box frozen under a thin layer of ice. The object was intact on the outside but empty on the inside. The scratches on the lid divided opinion. For some, they indicated haste. For others, they could just be old wear and tear. The small fragment of grey fabric stuck to the inner latch, however, was indisputable. 10 years later, Harriet Mullins would recognize that fabric as part of the lining of the coats sewn by Ruth. This finding reinforced the feeling that the sisters had left the vault alive, and at some point along the trail had separated from the rest of their belongings. The arrival of the authorities. The county sheriff, Jonathan Everard, did not arrive in the community until the 3rd day. His reports are objective, almost cold. He described the case as voluntary disappearance or loss of orientation during the night. But that explanation never convinced anyone, not even him. His handwriting changes in the last pages of the report, as if the writer no longer believed what he was trying to record. Everard conducted quick and inconclusive interviews. The sisters had no known enemies. There were no signs of conflict, no neighbors reported fights, and all their savings remained in the house. They had simply disappeared without taking anything. One detail in Everard's report, however, caught the attention of researchers decades later. No human footprints more than 200 meters from the vault. No recent breakage of vegetation. No trace of a carriage. This observation is what makes the disappearance even more enigmatic. In any direction you looked, there were no marks. It was as if the sisters had walked to a certain point, and from there on were erased from the physical world. Rumors of the time. As the days passed, the community was immersed in theories and rumors. Some believed that the sisters had gotten lost in the cold, an unlikely hypothesis, since they knew the region like few others. Others mentioned a possible kidnapping, but there were no signs of a struggle, footprints, or carriages. There were also older stories, rarely mentioned in official reports but preserved in oral memory. Stories about the valley's transportation routes and the horsemen who had disappeared years before. The coincidence of dates and the fact that the sisters had been seen walking in that direction fueled silent speculation. But none of this turned into concrete evidence. The human revelation. The 4th day of searching was decisive. It was snowing lightly when the Reverend, already exhausted, decided to visit the sisters' house. He wanted to collect any documents that might help with the investigation. There, he found something that never appeared in the official reports, perhaps out of collective superstition, perhaps out of historical shame. Under Eleanor's bed, inside a wooden folder, were her locked notebooks. The key, which she carried around her neck, was never found. The notebooks were only opened years later when the wood of the box gave way. Inside them were only 2 sentences written in the last days before the disappearance. "There is still time." And just below, "But not for us." This revelation never explained the disappearance, but it gave the community a kind of mourning that was possible. A silent, human mourning without fantasy. The idea that the sisters knew something was coming, but that they couldn't, or didn't want to, elaborate. And so the search officially ended on the afternoon of the 5th day. No bodies, no traces, no destination. The only thing left were these gaps, and the indisputable fact that 2 women disappeared after entering a forgotten warehouse, leaving behind only an empty box, an enigmatic phrase, and a silence that would somehow shape the entire memory of Cumberland. And upon revisiting these records, it becomes clear that the biggest revelation was not about what happened to them, but about everything that no one could admit at the time. There are cases that remain open not because there are no clues, but because time refuses to close what has been interrupted. The disappearance of the Marrowthicket sisters is one such case, a file that breathes, even more than a century later, as if there were still something in it that does not want to be forgotten. Decades after that December 1899, when county records began to be reorganized for historical preservation, the cataloger found, inside a darkened leather folder, an anonymous note, folded between old reports and minutes. The paper was brittle but still legible. It simply read, "Their story does not end where we look." This phrase, though brief, became the synthesis of all that remained of the sisters. There were no more documents to discover, no new testimonies to collect. What could be confirmed had already been confirmed, and what was missing would never emerge. Not because of negligence, but because the context of the time did not allow it to be recorded. Scholars who have studied the case over the years have realized that the real impact of the disappearance was not the event itself, but what it left hanging over the community. Cumberland was never quite the same again. Families began locking their doors, a habit that had previously been considered unnecessary. Children were instructed to avoid isolated trails, and for many years, no one else went down into the vault. The space was officially sealed in 1907 after a new report deemed the site unsafe. But for many residents, the seal did not just symbolize caution. It was also a kind of silent agreement, the idea that certain doors, once opened, should not be revisited. As a historian, the narrator of this archive knows that every reconstructed narrative is, on some level, imperfect. One works with what is left, fragments, memories, incomplete documents. The mystery of the Marrowthicket sisters, therefore, is not just a case to be solved. It is a mirror of what the past lets slip through the cracks of time. The empty box found in the ice, for example, has become a symbol of this gap. Today it is displayed in a modest showcase in the small county historical museum, unremarkable, without special lighting, simply positioned among everyday objects from that era. Many people pass by without noticing it, but those who know the story say that when you bring your face close to the glass, you can feel a kind of interruption, a void that is not a haunting, but a memory about to fade away. What about Eleanor's notebooks, which contained the two most disturbing phrases of all the sources? They have been preserved, although time has erased some of the ink. The phrase, "There is still time," remains clear. The second, "but not for us," is faded, almost transparent. Some interpret this as simply the effect of time. Others believe that the ink used there was of inferior quality. But from a symbolic point of view, it is difficult to ignore how this phrase, precisely this one, seems to dissolve along with the fate of the two sisters. In the end, after so many analyses, hypotheses, and revisions, the modern researcher ends the narrative with a conclusion that does not seem like a conclusion at all. He realizes that the case of the Marrowthicket sisters does not call for answers. It calls for silence. It calls for the pause that is taken when observing old documents, when one understands that certain things were not recorded, not because of carelessness, but because they were impossible to record. Perhaps Eleanor and Ruth realized something that others did not. Perhaps they consciously decided to walk away from what they knew, or perhaps they were swallowed up by circumstances that the world of 1899 had no language to describe. The truth is that all scenarios remain incomplete, and it is precisely this incompleteness that keeps the story alive. With each generation, someone revisits the case, rereads the testimonies, touches the glass of the display case where the empty box rests, and tries to imagine the last steps of the two sisters on that trail that led to Whistling Pines. But the more one tries to reach it, the more distant the event seems to become, as if the very act of searching pushes the mystery a few steps back in time. And so, more than a century later, the narrator closes this file in the same way that the community closed its search. Without certainty, without final answers, without a concrete farewell. Only with the feeling that some stories remain open because they were meant to remain that way. And the last sentence, the one that echoes even after the narrator falls silent, is simple and inevitable. Some disappearances never end. They just cease to be seen.